If you'd like to know how to paint this pretty periwinkle flower in watercolour with easy to follow step-by-step instructions to boost your confidence and make painting with watercolour a little less scary, then stick around. So I've already attached my paper to my watercolour board like this to stop it from buckling. So let's just begin with a quick supply rundown. So today for the greens, I'll be using Sap and Phthalo, Indigo and French Ultramarine for the blues, Permanent Violet and Yellow Ochre, but just use whatever colours you have, and I'll explain why a little later on in this video. All the materials I'll put in the description box below, and I've done a simple line drawing of the flower, and I'll put a traceable line drawing and a photograph for you to work from in our Facebook group, details in the description. If you don't like drawing freehand, I've just put an information card on the top of the screen right now to show you how I trace my drawings down. So we're working wet on wet to begin with. You can see me here just putting some water inside the outline of the flower and dropping in a really watery mix of French Ultramarine, and this will form the base that we will build our colours on later. I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through, particularly so if you're new to watercolour painting, because you can see how the process unfolds. So I'm just gently dropping in this beautiful French Ultramarine, working from the reference photograph, and just moving it around with my brush like this. Use whichever brushes you have, whichever brushes that you're comfortable using. And I'll just continue the process throughout all of the petals. And I've done the same wash on the little bud, as you can see, and I've now mixed a watery mix of indigo, and I'm adding it here just to form a little bit of detail. The brush I'm using at the moment is a number 0 size spotter, but just use whatever you have. On my palette here, I have a watery mix of phthalo green, which has a kind of blue undertone, and this is perfect for this side of the leaf here. We have a sort of bluish tinge to it, so just apply it as I'm doing here. And once I've applied the paint, I'm just using a damp brush to merge it into the paper, as you can see. It gives it a really, really soft edge. I'm using mixed media paper today and not watercolour paper as such, because I believe that not everyone has expensive watercolour paper within their stash, and mixed media paper is far more affordable. And actually, a little secret here, I prefer it because I find that it helps merge the colours together. Here I'm mixing a watery mix of Sap Green, 2 puddles here, and one I'm adding a little bit of indigo too, so that we have a really rich dark green to add to the colours. We can build up our greens in the same way that we build up our blues. So the initial wash is just going on to the first leaf like this. This time we are applying it wet and dry to have a little bit more control. It doesn't matter if you want to work wet and wet, just do whatever you feel comfortable with. At the start of this video, I say use whichever colours that you have, and there's a reason for this, and let's just pause for a second to explain why. Various brands of paints call their colours the same name. We have here an example of Sap Green, and you can see the Winsor & Newton, Sennelier, Schmink and Mungyo. They're called Sap Green, but the colours vary considerably. So just use the nearest colours that you have within your palette and your budget. I mean, these paints that I'm using today are all by Mungyo, and they are absolutely amazing quality paints. I don't know anything about their light fastness or anything like that, but as far as colour payoff goes, they are incredible. And I would say in terms of price, I would put them at a kind of student grade price point, but this is the first time I've used them and I'm absolutely delighted with them. But that is why I say use whichever colours that you have, the nearest colours that work for you. So going back to the painting tutorial now, you can see me just adding a little bit of the Sap Green onto the already phthalo green that we've applied, and I'm just using the tip of my brush that is just damp to merge the colours together like this. And you can see how easy these colours merge together. If you are new to watercolour painting and you haven't used them before, it's all about building up your layers slowly and gradually. That way you get a stronger depth of colour without your colours becoming messy or muddy. Here I'm adding a mid-tone mix of phthalo green and sap green mixed together, and I'm just beginning to put in the beginnings of a pattern here on the top leaf like this. Paying close attention to my reference photograph, and as I said at the beginning of this tutorial, the reference photograph and the traceable line drawing will be put in the Facebook group, details of which will be in the description. So join us over there and you can join our fast growing community and you can show off your paintings. So you can see me here just adding sap green with a tiny bit of indigo just to darken up, and adding a little bit of shape here and there with my number 0 size spotter brush. And just blend in those colours together with a sort of wiggly motion. This is a number 6 size spotter, and I'm using it damp just to merge these colours together with a plain water glaze with a very, very light touch. And just swatching this colour out here, we have sap green with indigo, and you can see how dark this green has now become, and we're just adding it where shown, working around some of the veins, doing negative painting, and then once again just blending the colours into each other. And remember, it's all about having fun with your art and just enjoying it. Botanical art need not be difficult, particularly if you just watch my videos and I'll show you how to improve your watercolour techniques. And it really is just about practicing. Now I'm beginning to just wiggle the brush to create a further pattern on this upper leaf, as you can see. You can see that I'm just picking up a small amount of pigment on my brush at a time and just working in small areas to have full control over the paint. I know that watercolour sort of has a bad press by being a tricky medium to work with, but really it is all about practice. But let me know in the comments if you have any sort of particular struggles with watercolour and the things that you maybe have difficulty with. Just drop them in the comments below and maybe I can answer some of your questions. So I'm just applying the sap green mix to this little leaf that's just folding underneath here, and once again blending in with that damp brush. And you can see me now adding the darker pigment. So the darker colour is indigo with sap green, and you can always add a bit more indigo if you'd like to make your colour a little bit darker. So I'm applying the sap green mix to this bottom leaf here, and I'm working around some of the veins in a sort of negative painting way. So we're painting around the shapes to create a shape. And as always, blending out those colours using a soft damp brush, and just continuing this process, looking at the reference photograph as I go through. So this is sap green on its own. So now that that colour has dried, we can focus our attention back over to the periwinkle flower head. The base colour has now dried, so we can start to think about building up the colour and adding some depth and form. So I have mixed on my palette a mid-tone mixed of French ultramarine, which means that it has a little less water than the first mix. And you can see I'm applying this over the existing wash that's now dry. And you can see that the underlying layer of the first wash is still visible, and yet we are building up form with the mid-tone. just using the brush in a kind of wiggling motion. And I've also got a puddle of permanent violet just to add a little bit of interest. The permanent violet wasn't in the photograph. I don't think. There maybe is an element of violet there, but I just thought I'd add it for a bit of interest. And just working around the little star-shaped center of the plant here, and using a little kind of dabbing motion to create the illusion of spikes where the center part is, just like this, using the number 0 size brush. And I'm keeping away from the pencil line around the edge there, as you can see, and I'm wetting down the other petals, and I'm dropping in French ultramarine wet on wet, as you can see here. So you could use wet on wet technique or wet on dry technique for this part. I just found that it made the process a little bit simpler to do it this way. You'll notice that I'm not applying the colour everywhere. I'm leaving gaps here and there because the colour on the flower head isn't sort of solid colour. You need to leave bits of light in between to make it look really, really natural looking. You want it to look plant-like and not a solid colour. So once again, adding that plain water and just dropping in the French ultramarine like this, with a tiny bit of violet. Honestly, I find that this mixed media paper is just really, really good for blending watercolour. It's far more forgiving, I think, than watercolour paper because it's not made of cotton and thereby easier to use your paints. But that's just my opinion, and whatever works for you. Now you can see me working around the star-shaped central part here, and it really makes that kind of white jump out now, and you can really see that that part is visible by doing this, and completing the process on the other petals. Once they're dry, I focus my attention back on the little bud, and I am adding the indigo in quite a thick consistency with a tiny bit of French ultramarine just to add a little bit of detail as shown, but always blending it into the existing wash. You can see me just patting in this colour using sort of a dabbing motion to get into the corners. Sometimes when you're working on smaller areas, it can be really difficult to get into the small, tiny little creases, but if you just pat your brush like this, you can get into those little corners with no problem. I've mixed a tiny puddle of yellow ochre and I'm applying it to the stalk where the bud is, and also to the tiny little area that's in the middle of the star. I suppose you'd call it the stamen of the flower head. So just working through with that very slowly and carefully. And then focusing my attention back on these beautiful bright green leaves. And once everything has dried, once again I found it necessary to do a plain water glaze with my soft brush just to kind of merge everything together. I have a watery mix of phthalo green on my palette here just to give a little bit of a blue tinge back to this side of the leaf here, and also the one on the top left hand side. And once again just blurring those colours together. If you're enjoying painting botanicals, we do have an online Patreon site if you'd like to join us there, and I'll put details once again in the description box below, where we have slightly more in-depth tutorials once a month. So returning my attention to the greens again, we have indigo with sap, going over the already lighter wash and darkening those colours up by just adding a stronger tone. Like this, once again, just blending those colours together, creating a really soft blur. And just keep building up these colours like this. Now we can really see this come together, building up all these colours. I'm using the same mix of sap green with a little bit of indigo, and I've added a tiny bit of phthalo green to this too, just to soften it out a bit and creating some more patterns on the leaves like this. And you can see how by blending out with that soft damp brush really helps these colours merge together, so you don't have any hard edges. So I've cleaned down my palette and I'm returning to the blues. We have a mix of French ultramarine and French ultramarine with a little bit of indigo, and you can see the consistency of the paint is slightly thicker now to add a little bit more detail to the flower like this. Just sharpening up some of the edges with my number 0 size spotter and using a kind of wiggly motion to create the illusion of texture and some veins like this. Here I'm using a number 2 size synthetic flat brush to lift out some of the colour where I felt that it was a little bit too heavy. So just using a damp brush just to lift out some of that colour like this. Sorry for the shaky camera there. I'm just putting some pigment, just have some permanent violet here, and just adding glazes here and there just to give it a bit more depth and a bit more interest. And you can just keep building these colours up until you're happy with the depth of colour. Now I'm adding the indigo mix. I have indigo with a tiny bit of French ultramarine, and I'm just enhancing the colours that we already put in place in the centre of the flower like this. Blurring them in, but don't take the colours right up to the white edge, and now enhancing it with some indigo. I'm just putting a sort of, again, using a stippling motion to add these little marks, and again in the centre like this. I'm using a mix of sap with indigo just to enhance some of the darker areas here and there and sharpen them up like this. And if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like. It's a free way of letting YouTube know that you like my content, and it means I can continue to provide these free videos for you. It really does help to support me on this wonderful platform. And it really is a question of just outlining and putting in the finer detail with the colours that we've already used until the painting is complete.